Hi, this video is going to be a bit different from normal. To summarize it quickly, I have a lot of video ideas, but sometimes they just aren't big enough for their own video. But I don't want to let those ideas just go unused, so today's video is about a bunch of smaller things related to playing Spy that I think are both interesting to think about and can help you play Spy a little better. I'm not a Spy messiah, nor am I honestly that great at him, but I did my best to make all these tidbits things that you probably haven't thought about much in terms of Spy play, even if you already have a lot of hours in the game. And another disclaimer, much of this advice is only given on the context of pub play. I've only played a single game of competitive as Spy, and playing Spy in competitive is often a very different beast than playing in pubs. So while these things will probably help you out a little bit in competitive, I can't say how effective they'll be overall. Firstly, I'm gonna expand a ton on an idea I mentioned in my first Spy video, using cover for stealth. But this time I really want to nail in just how much potential this has, and how little cover you actually need to sneak around effectively. Particularly in terms of decloaking, you'd be surprised how many spots there are around any map that let you go unnoticed. Props, raised walls, even tiny posts sticking out of the ground can be more than enough. And more importantly, many are near where enemies often gather. The best advice I can give to almost any new or intermediate Spy player is to minimize what I call your time of exposure, or TOE for short. Time of exposure I define as an amount of time as Spy where you're approaching an enemy and they're not currently behind cover, cloaked, or close enough to stab them, i.e. the amount of time the enemy has to turn around and see you before you stab them. In this Badwater clip, for example, I use this cover here to decloak for two reasons. One, it's cover, so obviously it helps me decloak. And two, it's still right next to where the enemy team is gathered. This means that as soon as I leave cover and start approaching them, there is a very small amount of time between me leaving cover and me being able to stab them. Another example, this Dust Bowl clip. I use the control point platform here for a really cheeky but hidden decloak spot. And again, I make sure that the moment I leave cover, I get a backstab as soon as possible. This segment has been a bit long for a video about a bunch of smaller tips, but I can't stress enough how important this is, as it's how I get at least 80% of my standard backstabs. Decloaking in a spot right by the enemy and moving very quickly from cover to enemy players. Experiment with aggressive but safe decloak spots, and learn to track player movement to get to their backs as fast as possible. My second tip of the trade is much more broad, and that is to do everything quickly. Aside from obvious exceptions where patience is required, when you're out and stabbing people, the faster you move and do everything, the more unpredictable you'll be. Swap between weapons quickly to keep the enemy guessing. Turn your trick stabs into one very quick and very fluid motion so enemies can't react. And move around the map using as many little shortcuts and tricks you can to get around just a little bit faster. Aggressive Spy can be very much a glass cannon, but being fast and unpredictable can be a surprisingly effective defense, as the longer you take to do certain things, the more time the enemy has to react or predict your movements. Next on the list is to never count out your revolver, no matter which gun you're using. This was originally going to be its own video, but the pacing and script never panned out, so I'm putting it here. Your revolver is very powerful, even though L'Étranger has some decent stopping power if you land your shots properly. Don't only use it for self-defense though. When you're roaming around with your team and stealth isn't something you're prioritizing, poking at any enemies you see with your revolver can be surprisingly effective at either finishing them off at any distance, or weakening them enough to make them retreat. Not only that though, but be sure to spend time practicing your revolver aim. Because it fires only a single bullet, this thing can be scarily consistent damage at any range if you're good enough with it. It's easily one of the more deadly weapons in the game, and punishing overconfident enemies is always very fun. And next up for number 4, always try to avoid looking at the person you're going to backstab. Looking at a specific enemy is a great way to let them onto your plan, and as I said earlier, being unpredictable is always to your benefit. And especially for trick stabs, looking at an enemy before you go for a matador or a corner stab is a great way to get instantly countered by any experienced players. Taking full advantage of not looking at enemies requires a pretty good sense of enemy habits and just being overall aware of where everyone is in relation to you. This stab in particular from my last video is a great example. In this game, the medic I stabbed here was really good, and going for any obvious stabs of them would never go well. Thus, I knew I had to be way sneakier about any stabs I go for, and I go for a blind stare stab that pays off. Fifth up is a bit of a specific one, but it works wonders somehow. Backpedaling while disguised.
Alright, this section I'm recording in post because originally here I said that this just, it's pretty effective, but it doesn't automatically give you a free pass for everyone. But I literally was getting footage for this and it just kept working. I kept just walking right by people and nobody knew. I don't know if I just figured out the cheat code for spy or whatever, but do this and it will work. Like, way more often than it should. It's not gonna work every single time, but it's kind of insane what I get away with here. Alright, back to pre-recorded.
Starting off the second half of this list is prioritizing your targets. And I don't just mean stabbing medics or heavies over scouts. I mean prioritizing taking down parts of the enemy team that are holding your team back. The best example I can use for this is playing offense out in Swiftwater. After you cap the first point, your team needs to push the cart through this cave. And you also have access to this flank route up top to get behind the cave. A habit I started to notice during my play is that I often repeatedly go through this flank route, attacking whichever engineers or other players are roaming around the area just outside the cave. All the while though, my team would be stuck actually getting through the cave with the cart, as it's often a great holding spot for red. The important part of this tip is recognizing these situations, when you're attacking enemies or sentries that just aren't important to take out right now. Look at the state of the game as a whole and try to find out which areas the enemy is holding off your team in, and prioritize those first. For number 7, your strafing keys are key for trickstabs. When you're trying to get to an enemy's back, it's just simple math that using A and D to strafe around the enemy is much more effective. And I don't mean just for corner stabs. The amount of stabs you can get by just repeatedly strafing in one direction and flicking your view in the other is just pretty wild. Watch this clip here where I get 4 very nice trick stabs one after the other. Every single one of these I got by using my A and D keys to strafe around them before going for the stab. I react to almost every player the exact same way and it works out. I get to their backs before they can even react and look towards me. Take another clip from Mountain Lab, where I get my first stab on the engineer. Then every stab after that, I'm constantly strafing and turning my mouse in one direction or the other. The players going after me can't keep up with the constant turning, and I'm able to get 3 very nice backstabs on them. Strafing is very powerful and it keeps you unpredictable. And speaking of unpredictable, don't make your trick stabs predictable. This seems like a cop-out since nobody's trying to make their trick stabs predictable, but there's a lot more nuance to this than it seems. I don't only mean being quick and hard to track. I mean stop thinking about trick stabs as different types of stabs. When someone's coming up a set of stairs, don't think, oh hey, it's stair stab time. Or when you lead someone around a corner, don't do the exact same motion for a corner stab every time. When you need to trick stab someone, your thought process shouldn't be to perform a specific memorized action, as that's exactly what any experienced player is looking out for. Instead, you should just think, what is the fastest way to get to this player's back and stab them? Instead of performing the same action every time, this gets you in the habit of choosing the best option for that specific scenario, not the same option. Instead of doing the tried and not so true method of jumping over enemies for stair stabs on this soldier, I instead recognize that I can just fall right onto him, and it works out. In this clip I've already shown you, I didn't specifically think, alright, it's time to matador stab these guys. Instead I thought, what are the habits they're demonstrating that I could exploit? I identified that their habits were being very aggressive and running right at me, so consistently strafing around them misled them, and got me some stabs. Don't think of stair stabs as something you can only do on stairs. Don't think of corner stabs as the stab you do around corners. Use these definitions to learn them in the first place, but mastering them requires you to be flexible, not to choose something from a list of predefined actions. Second to last applies to either the stock watch or the cloak and dagger. It's always better to cloak too early than too late. When you're peeking around a corner where there's danger, you'll often want to cloak before diving into enemy territory. In these situations, you can never overstate the importance of your presence not being known to the enemy. If you cloak even just a little bit late and they spot you, they're going right into alert mode and they'll probably spy check everywhere. People often want to cloak as late as possible without getting seen in order to make full use of their cloak meter, but this can be risky, and that's exactly why you might see me cloaking really early most of the time. The benefit gained from hiding from the enemy is much greater than just having a tiny bit more cloak meter to move around with. When just one puff of fire is all that's needed to get you killed, better safe than sorry is often the best move. And finally, the last and only one I consider to not be more of a tip but a suggestion, use different weapons, especially in terms of the different watches. The Dead Ringer is neat, but the ability to just go invisible on command is incredibly powerful, and I think that ability is almost necessary to at least learn the ropes of Spy and develop your skills. Also be sure to give the cloak and dagger a try. I think it has a bit of a bad reputation as the sit in a corner and do nothing watch, but the ability to choose exactly when you approach a situation is really powerful, and now it's my most used watch in most situations. And that pretty much does it for my general words of wisdom for spy players or just people looking for an interesting TF2 video. Again, I'm very far from a spy expert, but I found all these bits of advice to be integral to getting better at playing spy, and I find them all really interesting to think about and analyze why they work. I'm sorry this video took quite a while to put out, but the nature of it explains that gap pretty well. I've had a bunch of ideas floating around in my head, and I've even written out a few full scripts, but all of them felt pretty padded out and felt like I was stretching the topics thin. So instead of making a few not so great videos, I squished all those ideas together into this one, and I hope I help you learn a thing or two about playing spy.